Good morning, Christian Hills. How many of you feel refreshed, ready to go? Awesome. I love it. How many of you stayed up an extra hour later last night? Yeah. How many are embarrassed to say it? It feels good to get that extra hour back. So this morning we're starting a new series called Your Work Matters. It's the intersection of faith and work. And I'm extremely excited to talk with you guys about it today. One, because it's a passion of mine. I really like the topic, but it's also been incredibly important in my own life, how these two worlds essentially collide. Sometimes when we think about work, we maybe think about it as a dichotomy. On the one end, I've got work, and then I've got my life over here, right? We don't think about them connecting a whole lot. I work over here to provide for my life over here. Or maybe we think about like our Christianity or our faith with Jesus, and that encompasses our life, but then over here is work. We think about them kind of on these separate planes. This dichotomy. How does Jesus fit into my work? And we define work somewhat broadly here to mean anything from being a mom, a dad, full-time, part-time, multiple jobs, volunteer work, talking about it really broadly. How does Jesus influence that part of my life? Now, if you believe that in Jesus, and you believe that Jesus does change every aspect of our lives, surely the thing we do at work, the thing we spend most of our days and time doing, surely knowing Jesus should inform that, right? Surely believing in Jesus should change the way that I work. But if I were to get 10 of you to come up here and ask you how Jesus influences your work, we probably would have 12 answers, right? Some of you might say, well, honestly, have no idea. I check people out. That's it. Check them out and I go home. I work to survive. I don't know how Jesus impacts that. Not that I don't believe in Jesus, I just don't know how it impacts that. And on the other end, you might say, well, yeah, I've read what Paul says, do everything unto the Lord, not unto men, so I do all of my work really, really well. And then maybe there's some of you in the middle that are like, I know it does and I just don't know how. I know it should. I know believing in Jesus and this thing that we read and the stories we read in the Bible should impact the way that I work. I spend most of my time there, but I don't know how. I don't know how. So wherever you land in that spectrum, the fact that we have questions means we should talk about it, right? We should be equipped. We should be ready to answer that. How does Jesus, believing in Jesus and this story that we read about, change the way that we work? I think one of the main things we might be missing as Christians who are asking this question is that we lack a grander story. That we lack a grander story about how our work fits into Christianity. Think about a way that a story works. When you read a book, are there large portions of it that have nothing to do with the story? No, it'd be a bad story. It'd be really boring. Right? When we think about a story and God's story specifically, when we see ourselves within that story, all of a sudden we have bigger purpose, a bigger vision. We have a bigger reason, a bigger why. So until we see ourselves fitting into the bigger story of God's story, we're going to end up just thinking that our work is there just to survive. We're just there to pay the bills. Work doesn't really have any purpose. But what if I could convince you that it does? I want you to walk away this morning knowing two things. I want you to, one, know that God cares about your work. That God cares about your work. Secondly, that you can glorify God in your work. Are you ready? Let's do it. Chapter 1, verse 1 of the Bible, Genesis 1, if you would turn with me there. Book 1, chapter 1, verse 1. Yeah, I think I just got it. Except it's, oh, there we go. All right, cool. We're ready. Verse 1, chapter 1. In the beginning. Now stop. What kind of stories start out this way? What kind of stories start this way? Epic tales, right? Epic tales start out this way. In the very beginning, once upon a time, right? So maybe, just maybe, we've found a story that will give our work purpose, huh? What do you say? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now stop. Got a lot to talk about this morning. When we come to Genesis, a lot of times we come as foreigners. Have you ever seen those pictures of people who visit France and they've got the tube-high white socks up to here? And they're all dressed in the same shirt that says, from China, right? And they're like taking, like they stick out like a sore thumb, right? I remember when I was studying abroad in college, we went through some of Europe, and one of the things they said was, make sure you just learn a few phrases in the languages of the countries you're going. It kind of breaks down some barriers, and it lets you know, like, hey, I've done some work. I care about your culture. I'm not here just to impose my own culture, even if it's just a simple hello, hi, how are you, where's the bathroom? Right? We came as foreigners, but we're trying to understand it. Now, when we come to Genesis, this wasn't written in 2018, surprise. This was written a long time ago. And so we come with some of these preconceived notions about how things work in our own lives, some of these preconceived ideas. And one of the things we have to do when we come to Genesis is just stop for a moment, because this wasn't our world when it was written. This wasn't the time and place that we find ourselves in now. So we kind of have to step back, say, okay, I don't fully understand. Let's try and dive into how the author might be explaining this. Now, when he says heavens and earth, how long do you think the image of the blue and green globe has been in our minds? Roughly? Now, I know some of you are like, oh, I didn't know it was oblong. Surprise. How long has this been in our minds? So this picture was the first picture taken fully of the entire globe. I know you can't read that, but this is, in case you're curious, this picture was taken in 1972. It was the first image of the entire Earth in view, okay? Just 40 years ago, 50 years ago. The very first image of Earth, very first image we've ever been able to get of Earth is this beautiful thing right here. This was taken in 1942. So, at most, when we think about Earth as this blue and green globe, we've been able to process that image for this century a little bit more. I mean, obviously we knew the Earth was round, but in terms of like actually getting a photograph of it, that's how long we've roughly thought about this. So when we come to Genesis and we read God created the heavens and the earth, let's put ourselves, take ourselves out of 2018, this century. Let's put ourselves in their shoes and think about what he's talking about. God created the heavens and the earth. So what are the heavens? What would be the heavens? What's up there? Yeah, what's up there? What's the earth? What's down here? Right? God created what's up there, and God created what's down here. Let's move on. Now sometimes we come to Genesis and we ask all of these questions that we want answered because we think Genesis can answer all of those questions. Sometimes we bring questions Genesis wasn't intending to answer. Sometimes we come with these preconceived notions of how Genesis should answer something, and we don't think about the message the author is trying to get across. So we read in the first few lines, God created what's down there. In the very beginning, God created what's up there. Let's keep moving. Verse 2. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. Now, without form and void is in the Hebrew is translated, or it comes from the words tohu vavohu. Can you say that with me? Tohu vavohu. It's a blast to say. You're going to be saying it all day. This means without form or void. It's very tough to translate. And some of your translations may have had it just a little bit different than mine. I think one of my favorite ways to translate this keeps that rhyme. Wild and waste. Wild and waste. What kind of things are wild and waste? Deserts and places that are void of substance, right? Now, is wild and waste a bad thing? No, it's not. It's not bad, or it's not good. I mean, if you're a snake or a lizard, it's going to be awesome, right? That's your natural habitat. Who is wild and waste particularly bad for? Humans. Humans, right? It's bad for humans. We don't live in wild and waste places. We build cities and civilizations. It's particularly bad for humans. We keep reading, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. Now, what does it mean to hover? What do you do when you're hovering? You're waiting, you're watching, right? You're ready to pounce. Something is about to happen in this wild and waste, in this tohu vavohu that we find ourselves in Genesis 1 and 2. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning the first day. So, let me ask you this. Is light something you can hold? No. Light is not something we can hold. We might think of it as photons or electromagnetic radiation within a certain field of the electromagnetic spectrum. Right? What is light? How can you just create light out of nothing? Then God separates the light. So he creates the light, he separates it, and he puts it into these categories of day and night. Who are these categories particularly useful for? Humans. Animals don't care. Like, sure, some of them sleep and hibernate and whatever, but day and night, who are those particularly useful for? Humans. Us. Right? God is creating a place that's useful for humans. So he separates light and darkness. Now, I wish we could go through all of this, but we don't have a ton of time. So we're going to skip a few verses. We're going to go down to verse 11. And God said, "Let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees bearing fruit, in which their seed, each according to its kind, on the earth." And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed according to their own kind, and trees bearing fruit, in which there is seed according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. There was evening and morning the third day. Again, we can't come to Genesis and ask questions it wasn't intended to answer. Because I come to this and I go, okay, what about all the coniferous trees? What about the evergreens? God, did you make those? No, what does it say he made? Trees that bear seeds and trees that bear fruit. Now, I know. Kathy has some apple trees, and those apple trees are also good for specific animals, or at least they deem it on themselves to eat of those trees, despite the fact that Kathy has grown them for herself. But who is fruit trees particularly useful for? Humans, right? Right. They're good for us. We like fruit. We eat seeds. These trees are good for us. So we can see throughout this creation process that God is creating a world, a place that's specifically good for humans. It's good for us. He's creating order out of the chaos that we find here. It's interesting because as we look through the creation story, and as you continue to read it maybe in your own time, you'll see that what God was creating was this incredible place that was not only for the benefit of himself. He found great joy in it. He said it was good. but he was creating this place that was good for humans, good for us. So in the beginning, we see God's work is designed not only for himself, but to benefit others. And the way he works is he creates order out of chaos. Now, the Hebrew word for good, after every day, he says, and it was good, is tov. Now, how funny is this? That God creates tov out of tohu vavohu. That's fun. Little wordplay from the author of Genesis. That God is in the business of creating order out of chaos. Creating something that has the ability to sprout, that has all this potential. And God creates it not only for himself, he's not the only one here, he's creating it for us. He's creating it for us. So God's work is not only for his own benefit, but so that we benefit as well. So we've seen God's work. Now let's look at our work. We're going to skip ahead to Genesis 2, verse 5. Now when no bush of the field was yet in the land, and no small plant of the field had yet sprung up, for the Lord God had not caused it to rain on the land, and there was no man to work the ground. There was no man to work the ground. So God creates all of this potential, all of these things that create other things, all this incredible life that's just waiting to be blossomed into trees, and it says there's no man to work the ground. It's interesting. Genesis 1 and 2 are really neat in the sense that Genesis 2 is a reflection of Genesis 1, just told a little bit differently. So we're kind of bouncing back and forth, but we're hearing this story of God creating earth, and he creates it, and he says there's no one to work the ground. There's no one to cultivate and bring forth the potential that's there. So what are we going to do? He creates man and woman. If you go up just a little bit into chapter 1, verse 28, he says, and God blessed them. This is after he created man and woman in his image. And God said to them, be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it. Have dominion over the fish of the sea and of the birds of the air and over every living thing that moves on the earth. So God puts us in the garden, or man and woman, and says, your job is to subdue it, to have dominion over it, and then to multiply. Now, subdue is not a real fun word. But was this word pre-fall or post-fall? If you know, you're pre-fall. Yeah. Before the corruption came, God said, you're going to subdue the earth. So we can't put all of these negative connotations we might have with this word here. What God was telling us to do is your job is to bring forth the potential that is there. So what happens when you subdue something? When you work it in the good sense? Now, I've recently seen this in action. My wife and I and the kids and Kathy went to an apple orchard. And it was unbelievable. Now, I'll tell you this. They had way more trees than Kathy had. Way more. Like an unbelievable amount more trees than Kathy had. And we could just walk through aisles, pick up apples, eat them, throw them. Not that we would. But there was apples upon apples, and then you had to take a tractor to get from apple field 1 to apple field 2. Why? Because these people subdued the apple trees. They implanted them, they took them, they put them in rows, they grew them, they watered them. They put whatever special substance they do to make them grow. What did they do? They subdued the apple trees. They had dominion over the apple trees. God is saying you bring forth the potential that's there. Your job is to subdue and have dominion. Bring forth, not only to provide for yourself, but in the same way I created you in my image, you're going to benefit others. How? He says, multiply. Well, why doesn't he tell rabbits to multiply? Well, they just do it, right? Literally. They just do it. Rabbits just make other rabbits, right? You don't have to tell animals to go make other animals. It's like in their instinct, right? If you've ever had a dog in mating season, it's like They just do it naturally. It's in their nature. But he tells us as humans to go and multiply, right? Because what happens when we create other humans? We don't just create children. We don't just create people. We create civilizations. We create cities. We create culture. We create people who make apple orchards so that we can go get those apples, right? So he says, go and multiply, because what happens when we create more people is we literally change the earth. We're literally changing the earth. That's why he says, you subdue, you have dominion, and you go forth and multiply. Make more of that. Because our job as people is to have dominion, subdue, take the creation God has made, bring it forth to benefit ourselves and others, and then create more. So we've seen God's work, God's design for work. God has given us a purpose in work. One verse I was going to read to you is in 15. The Lord took man, in chapter 2, verse 15, took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to what? To work. To work. Is given us purpose and vision. That in God's creation we have a purpose. We have a vision. Work has a purpose. That's part of the reason we're here. To cultivate and bring forth the potential that God has put here. Now, how long do the good times last? Unfortunately. Not very long. Because we have God's design for work. We've got our purpose in God's creation. But then we have the corruption of work. Would you read with me chapter 3, verse 1? Now the serpent was more crafty than any of the other beasts of the field that the Lord God had made. And he said to the woman, did God actually say, you shall not eat of any of the trees in the garden? And the woman said to the serpent, we may eat of the fruit in the trees in the garden, but God said, you shall not eat of the fruit of the tree that is in the midst of the garden, neither shall you touch it, lest you die. But the serpent said to the woman, you will not surely die. For God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. Now stop. Up until this point in the story, who has been the sole proprietor of good? God has. God has defined what's good. He creates light and separates it, and it's good. He creates spaces for oceans and land. He says it's good, and then he fills them. He says it's good, and he creates man, and he says it's very good. Up until this point, God has defined good. So in this moment, they're faced with this conundrum because the snake in the tree says, you want to know what's good and evil yourself? They have this decision to make in the moment. Are they going to submit to God's definition of good? God's definition of what's good? Or are they going to try and get their own moral maturity and define what's good and right for themselves? They get to choose if they want to decide what's good. Or they can trust that when God said it was good, it was good. And what happened? They ate it. They decided they wanted to know what was good and evil. And immediately they got this moral maturity and they knew that they were naked and they were ashamed of it. So what happens? They get cursed. Chapter 3, verse 18. Now let's start at 17. And he said to Adam, because you have listened to the voice of your wife, and have eaten of the tree of which I commanded you, you shall not eat it. Cursed is the ground because of you. In pain you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the plants of the field, but by the sweat of your face you shall eat bread, till you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken, and from you, and for you are dust, and to dust you will return. Now, are we still allowed to eat? Yeah, he says 3 times. You're going to eat, you're going to eat, you're going to eat. But it's going to be hard. Why? Because you have thorns and thistles. Thorns and thistles now are going to get in the way of your work. I think this is a beautiful metaphor that the author uses. Because now in the midst of our work, in our daily work, we face moral decisions every single day, don't we? Every day we're forced to say, do we submit to God's definition of good? Or are we going to choose for ourselves what's right and what's wrong? Am I going to act in a way that's uplifting of God's kingdom, of God's definition of good, or am I going to put myself in place of God and make sure I get it, the credit? Thorns and thistles are these moral choices that we're now faced with every day. Work's going to be tough. Work's going to be difficult. It's not going to be easy. Kathy has a garden. I know she's made her way into the sermon a lot. She's you have to see her backyard someday if you haven't. She's got this beautiful garden, and it has these beautiful flowers and trees that she's taken care of, and this little pond. But what gets in the way of your garden, Kathy? Weeds, yeah, but is there any, yeah. What eats all of your flowers? Rabbits! Rabbits! Oh, man. Kathy has an arch enemy, and it is an animal, and it's a rabbit. Because why? The rabbits come, and they come into the garden, and they eat all the flowers, they eat all the trees, all the hard work that she's cultivated to bring forth from the ground, the rabbits come and eat. It's a good picture of work. It's just hard. All this work that I do gets destroyed. Or I'm faced to live in a world where other people are also sinning. So I'm having to deal with their sin and my own sin. Talk about thistles and weeds, right? Yeah, work is tough. Work is tough. Thanks a lot to Adam and Eve. Work is tough. And that's where we find ourselves now. Kind of have these comparable versions of work if you look in Genesis 1 and Genesis 3. In the midst of the garden, Adam and Eve are thriving, and they're working in God's garden as God had designed it, and He's bringing forth this potential and cultivating it. God put them there to work in the garden, and then all of a sudden we've got, you're going to still work, but it's going to be a lot harder. A lot harder. We live in a corrupted version of work. Work has been corrupted. We've seen God's design for work. We've seen our vision, our purpose in God's design for work. And we have the corruption of work. Which begs the question, will there be a redemption of work? Will there be a redemption of work? Now, I want to read with you guys the most important verses in the entire Bible. So get ready. It's in chapter 3, starting at verse 14. The Lord God said to the serpent, because you have done this, cursed are you above all livestock and above all the beasts of the field. So who's he talking to? The snake, the serpent. On your belly you shall go, and dust you shall eat all the days of your life. So is the snake cursed? Snake's cursed. Verse 15, I will put enmity between you and the woman. Who's you? The snake. Easy question so far. You've got the snake and you've got the woman. And between your offspring and her offspring. Who's the your offspring? The your offspring in this verse. Between your offspring and her offspring. Yeah, so the snake has offspring and the woman has offspring. So now we can see from these two lines that there's two specific lineages, right? There's the lineage of the deceiver, the snake, and there's the lineage of the woman. He shall bruise your head. Who's your head? The snake's head. So who's he? He is a man from the lineage of the woman. Now, the man who's the offspring of the woman who's coming doesn't crush the snake's offspring. The man crushes the snake, the head, the deceiver. And you shall bruise his heel. The snake will bruise his heel. What's so impactful about this verse is, one, right away we see a prophecy to Christ coming. That he, the offspring of the woman, specifically outlined in this verse, not the woman, it's not the snake, it's another person coming who's going to crush the head of the snake. He's not going to crush the offspring of the snake. No, his job is to crush the snake, the head of the snake. That somebody's coming that's going to crush the head of the snake. But what's going to happen? As he crushes the head of the snake gets his heel. And what's amazing about this is that as he crushes the head of the snake, he, Jesus, absorbs the venom of the snake onto himself. So that as he absorbs the venom of the snake, these deceptive decisions, this wrong morality, this offspring, this lineage, and he frees us from having to choose between those two lineages. How powerful is that? That in the beginning of the Bible, right off the bat, we've got God's design for work, our purpose in work, the corruption of work, but wait, God's coming back. And he's going to crush the head of the snake. That is so, so powerful. Now, as we've gone through Genesis, are you convinced yet that God cares about your work? God cares about your work. In fact, what's so interesting is in the beginning of Genesis, all the work was manual labor. All of this was manual labor, right? Does God care specifics about what you work? I mean, in some ways, in the corrupted fall, we now have this choice to subdue not only the earth but other humans, and I think that's wrong. There's jobs and roles that will subdue other humans, but ultimately, does God really care what your work is? I mean, like, he cares about what you're doing, but he's not saying all of you have to be priests. No, in the beginning we find Adam and Eve doing manual labor in the garden. And then it gets corrupted. So we know the redemption's coming, but where do we currently live? Live in the corruption of work, right? It's not easy. We have to live in this definition of work that's so difficult. So, how can we glorify God in our work? How can we glorify God in our work? There's 3 ways that I think you can, no matter what you do. The first one is task excellence. This is when you come to a job and you're getting paid or benefited to do something specifically. Maybe you're not getting paid, but down the road that child will benefit you later. Can you do a really, really good job at what you've been asked to do? Can you do above and beyond what you've been asked to do? Yeah. Did God do a really great job creating this earth? Yeah, he did. Woo! Have you seen this guy? Yeah. You can do a really, really good job in what you do. I think this also lines up into, you kind of have these 2 choices within this, because task excellence can come with 2 other sins. We live in a corrupted world. I'm sorry. This is just the way it is. The first one is you can subscribe to laziness. I'm going to be lazy. I'm not going to do it. I don't care. I'm just going to barely get by. Yeah, I know I could do a better job, but I don't really care. Right? You've got the sin of laziness. On the other side, though, you've got the sin of workaholism. That way overdoing it so that everything else in your life suffers. because you've given yourself over to something else. Task excellence is saying, I'm going to do a really, really, really good job of this, what I'm asked to do here. The second way I think you can glorify God in your work is moral excellence. Every day we're going to be faced with decisions that we can either choose to glorify the kingdom of God, we can choose to subscribe to the lineage of Jesus and Eve, or we can choose to submit to the lineage of the deceiver, the one that said, you choose for yourself what's good and evil. It's funny. I was asked to preach, and I love this topic. And I thought this is great. I've had a few weeks to try and put some thoughts together for you. And it's funny because every time I feel like I'm asked to preach, the Lord is so generous in giving me sermon material for that week. Donald knows. Right? Like you preach on humility and you're just forced to face decisions of your own buffoonery and pride, right? So I'm in this situation, and without getting into all the details, at work I'm forced to face these decisions. I was in the midst of this really frustrating situation where things were being decided that I was not on board with, was not a fan of. It wasn't morally wrong or anything, just didn't agree with what I thought we should go. And so I'm suffered, and essentially I'm forced to essentially choose a new position. And I was very frustrated. I really enjoyed what I was doing day to day, and I was frustrated. One, that I'm like, I don't know if I agree with this direction, and now I'm being forced to go into a new position. And I could have gotten so upset at my boss. The decisions and the way they talked about it was just frustrating. And the temptation to choose my own right and wrong, to subvert somebody else, to step on somebody's toes, to blackmail somebody was there. God, this is just so frustrating. What do I do? Sermon material. And it was just genuinely frustrating. You can ask my wife. I'm forced to make this decision. And of course, with the Lord's help, I feel like I was able to take a moral high road, but it's still, there's that opportunity. And I think each of you have never faced that before in your entire career, right? Okay, cool. So you have. And it's frustrating, right? Having to make these moral decisions in the time period that we live in, when you could act your own way. You could decide for yourself what's good and evil. Or are you going to submit to God's lineage, the lineage of the woman, the kingdom, the one that defines God's good as good? The last one I want to talk about is Christian witness. How cool is it that in this room Monday morning, a whole bunch of us get to go into workplaces with people that don't believe in Jesus? Right? How cool is that? That we in those settings can be Christian witnesses, that we can tell others about this incredible story that has changed our work and our life and impacts us so greatly. That we can go into a workplace and save people. This is cool. Now, the other two, when you do them really well, can be really great Christian witnesses. But I also encourage you to pray that God would open doors, that you're in your place for a reason, and I guarantee it. Even if it's not the career that you necessarily want to be in long term, if it's not the place that you love going, Monday morning doesn't excite you, you're there for a purpose and a reason. Now, I'm not saying you have to stay there forever, but I'm saying if you do these things really well, that you are glorifying God in your work. It's funny because in my own story, this has been such a big turning point for me. When I was young, I was in high school. I thought I was going to go into film school. That's what I really wanted to do. I wanted to edit movies. And so during high school, we started going to some different schools, and they were all like $60,000 a year or something crazy. And it just didn't have the money, and it wasn't really getting scholarships and whatever. And so we're going along, and I'm like, I don't know where to go. And I went to this youth conference, and I met a guy named Brian Bauer, who's a pastor here in the local area. He actually was a pastor at this church for a little while. And he was starting this program called Master's Commission. There's this 9-month discipleship school. You go, you commit yourself to the Lord for 9 months in the local church. You study, you pray, you do some things that utilize your skills. And at first I was like, yeah, but it's like wasting a year of college and whatever. And finally he's like, Vernon, what could go wrong if you gave just 1 year of your life committed to the Lord? What could go wrong? And I couldn't answer the question, and so I prayed about it and really felt like, okay, this is the direction God wants me to go. I can figure out film school later. And it was in the midst of Master's Commission that I really felt God's calling on my life to be a shepherd or a pastor. It was like unshakable. I don't know how to describe it. I couldn't tell you necessarily. That was the calling that God had put on my life, and I felt the weight of it. And so that kind of changed the direction. All of a sudden, like, yeah, I'm interested in film, but like this is where God's leading me. And so after the 9-month discipleship program got done, I applied for one school, and to this day, I don't know why I only applied for one school. Looking back, it was obviously God. I applied for Moody, and I got in, and so I packed up my stuff the following August, and I went. And that, I think, experience of going through Moody has just been so impactful, because it was like at no time in that point did I ever think this is the wrong thing for me. And I know that's not everyone's story. Some people go through college and figure their life out right as they retire, right? Like you don't know what God's calling you to, and it's hard to figure out. And I had landed in, and I was like, this is what God's calling me to do, and I know it. And towards the end, I met this beautiful lady. Ashley Johnson. That's actually how I got involved in this church. And so we ended up getting married. It was last year of school, and we were really committed to being a part of this local church. And I loved it. Towards the end of my career at Moody, I just had odd jobs and whatnot. And I was working in the online school. And I was working on similar like social media stuff, their marketing for the online school. And I found myself really enjoying it, like really loving it. And so after school, they hired me full time, and it was great because it was a great little income to provide for Ash and I, who were newly married at the time. And I loved it. I'm like, this is great. Ended up leaving there a few years later and went to a different school and still loved it. And I had this crisis at that point, because a lot of my friends from Moody, who also were in pastoral ministry, who also felt called to be pastors, were pastoring churches. They're in churches, they were hired on staff, they were preaching on Sundays. And I felt this weird feeling of like, God, I feel called to be a pastor, and yet I feel called in this career. Like, what is it? Should I quit? Do I stay here? Like, can I actually live out the calling that you've put in me while I go to a 9-to-5 essentially? And I remember talking to some of my buddies at the time, and they're like, Vernon, why are you even asking the question? Like, clearly God has put you in this place for a reason. God is still using your gifts in the local church. God is still using the calling He's put on your life. And you get to be in the workplace and in the ministry. There is no separation. And it was like this realization that I was separating, 9-to-5 work, what I did over here Monday through Friday, from like being paid by a church to be in a church. I was separating those two. And that's in my life, this realization that God can work through both of those things has been incredibly impactful. That I can both be called in the moment right now. God has called me to where I'm at. That I can be a Christian witness in a place with a whole bunch of non-believers. That I can do really, really, really good work. That I can choose the moral high road in those settings and still feel this calling of a shepherd. And I don't know specifically what God's calling you to do. I don't know what ministry God has put on your heart. But for the vast majority of you, you're not paid by Christian Hills, are you? If you are, no, I'm kidding. Most of you are not paid to come here, right? But God still has a calling on your life, a ministry on your life. And you can somehow still be a part of this local body doing ministry here and outside these walls. That God has a purpose for you, for the work that you do. I want you guys to wake up Monday morning when you go to head into work to see your story fitting into the broader story of what God's doing. That your work and God's story fit together. That what you're doing for work is not outside of God's plan. It's not outside over here. It's not anti-God. That what you're doing can fit into God's story. Because God made us in his image. God made us in the image of him. And literally, when you see somebody working, you're seeing God's image and design for work. How cool is that? That in that moment, you are fulfilling God's calling in your life. Now, as I close, some of you are probably in jobs you'd rather not be in. You wake up Monday and it's a dread, and I get it. You wake up Monday and it's just not where you want to be. Others of you may go in Monday morning and just loving it. This is what you're called to do. I think we all need prayer. But specifically, I want you guys to think about praying for your influence, praying for how you can glorify God in your work if you love being there. But I also encourage you, we're going to have team members up here, that if you're in a position, you're like, I don't know what God's call is on my life, I don't know where I'm headed, or I'm not in the job I want to be in, come up and give prayer. Just because you're not loving where you're at right now doesn't mean you have to stay there forever. Doesn't mean that's where God called you. Maybe God will change your heart and you will love. Maybe God has you there for a real specific reason, for somebody that's there. God's working on somebody in that workplace. God has a purpose for your work. God cares about your work. I hope you believe that today. God, we thank you for your vision of work. We thank you that you care about work. You've designed it. You've put it into motion. You've given us a purpose and a vision in it. And that despite in the corruption of work, we can still glorify you. We can still choose your morality, your lineage, your kingdom. God, I pray that you'd help us to wake up Monday with a renewed passion, a renewed vision of how our story fits into yours. How you've designed work and how we can be a part of that day